The bustling city streets outside gleamed with the promise of success, but inside a small, modest restaurant, life moved slower. The clinking of silverware, soft murmurs of conversation, and the occasional hiss of the kitchen set the tone for the day. At a small table by the window, a lone figure moved with quiet purpose. Tommy, a young man in his early 20s, with dark, unruly hair and worn-out clothes, wiped down the tables with mechanical precision. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of his hidden dreams. He had worked at the corner bistro for 2 years, his life confined to the shadows of the rich, always overlooked, always invisible. To the customers, he was just another waiter, a faceless cog in the machine. He served drinks, cleared plates, and moved in the background, his ambition slowly dying beneath the weight of disappointment. He had dreams, big ones. He wanted to be seen, to prove to the world that there was more to him than a waiter. But today, something was different. There was a shift in the air, an undercurrent of anticipation he couldn't place. As he moved through the restaurant, his gaze met a regular customer. Richard Grant, a man who had been a fixture in the upscale world of business for decades. His suit sharp, his demeanor colder than a winter's day, Richard was a billionaire, a name that echoed in boardrooms and newspapers alike. Yet Tommy had never paid much attention to him. They had exchanged pleasantries, nothing more. Today, however, their eyes locked for a moment longer than usual. Tommy could sense something in Richard's gaze, an unspoken recognition. But what did it mean? Tommy brushed it off, too lost in his own thoughts to linger on it. He had a job to do. But as he reached the back of the restaurant, something strange happened. Richard got up from his table, his steps confident yet deliberate toward Tommy. "Hey, kid," Richard said, his voice deep and commanding. "You've been here for a while, haven't you? I've seen you work. You've got potential." Tommy froze, a jolt of disbelief racing through him. What was going on? Richard smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing. "Mind if I have a word?" The room seemed to stop as Tommy's heart pounded. Little did he know, this was the beginning of a conversation that would change everything. The night carried an air of normalcy, the quiet clinks of glass and murmurs from surrounding tables, adding to the relaxed ambiance of the upscale restaurant. Jason moved through the crowd with practiced ease, but tonight, something was different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air. As he approached Mr. Anderson's table, a smooth smile instinctively crossed Jason's face. The usual order, the usual pleasantries. Mr. Anderson took the drink without a second thought, his eyes scanning the room as he absent-mindedly took a sip. Jason was about to leave when suddenly, Mr. Anderson's voice broke through the noise. "Wait a second, son. Are you... Jason?" The words hit Jason like a thunderclap, and he froze mid-step. He turned slowly, confusion knitting his brow. There was something in Mr. Anderson's eyes, a flicker of recognition. Or was it something else? A moment of doubt stirred in Jason's chest. "I'm sorry," Jason stammered, trying to mask his unease. "Do we know each other?" Mr. Anderson leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharpening as he studied Jason, a look of intense scrutiny playing across his face. Jason's stomach churned slightly under the weight of that gaze, but he held steady. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Mr. Anderson said, his voice now laced with something more than curiosity. Jason shook his head, uncertainty growing in his chest. The words didn't add up. How could someone like Mr. Anderson know him? He had no recollection of ever meeting the man before. As Jason stood there, it was as though the rest of the world had faded away. The noise of the restaurant dulled, and it felt like they were in a bubble of their own, suspended in a moment that couldn't last. Mr. Anderson stood up, his towering figure now closing the gap between them. Jason instinctively took a small step back, but Mr. Anderson reached out, steadying him with his gaze. There was something magnetic in the way he looked at Jason, something Jason couldn't place but made his heart beat faster. Mr. Anderson's voice lowered, almost a whisper, but loud enough for Jason to hear clearly. "I'm not sure how to say this, but I've been looking for you for a long time. Jason, you're my son." The words cut through the air with the sharpness of a blade, and Jason's world seemed to stop. His body stiffened, his mind raced, his thoughts colliding in a frenzy, trying to make sense of what had just been said. His son. This couldn't be real. It was too much. Too impossible. His mind spun as he glanced around the room, desperate for anything to anchor him to reality. But it all felt distant now, out of focus. Jason's voice barely broke through the fog in his mind. What? What do you mean? The words felt hollow, empty. There was a sinking feeling in his chest that grew heavier with every passing second. This was insane. But Mr. Anderson's face didn't shift. He wasn't joking. This wasn't some strange coincidence. Mr. Anderson's stare remained fixed. I've been searching for you for years, Jason. I thought I lost you. His words were heavy, laden with something deeper than just a simple revelation. Jason's heart pounded in his ears as he processed the enormity of what he had just heard. A lost son? A father seeking him out after all this time? Jason could only stand there, frozen in disbelief, as the room seemed to shrink around him. The world outside his vision blurred, and all he could focus on was Mr. Anderson's solemn face. This was just the beginning. Jason stumbled back, his mind racing to catch up with what Mr. Anderson had just said. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his vision blurring for a moment. The bustling restaurant, the clattering of plates, and the low murmur of conversations all seemed to fade into the background as the weight of the words hit him like a tidal wave. You're my son. Jason's heart hammered in his chest, his breath quickening. He blinked, trying to clear his mind, but the questions swirled in his head, louder and louder. How is this possible? Why didn't I know? What does this mean for me? The memories of his childhood, the foster homes, the endless faces of strangers, flashed before his eyes. All his life he had felt the emptiness of not knowing where he came from, of not having a place he could truly call home. And now, standing here in front of this stranger who claimed to be his father, Jason didn't know what to think. Mr. Anderson watched him, his eyes filled with an understanding Jason couldn't quite comprehend. There was no judgment in his gaze, only patience and something softer. Remorse? Regret? I didn't know about you until recently, Mr. Anderson said, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. A family secret, but I've learned the truth now. You were adopted, Jason, and you have every right to know who your real family is. The words barely registered at first. Jason's knees felt weak, and he took a step back, finding himself clutching the edge of the chair behind him for support. His mind spun, trying to process everything. Adopted? This man, this stranger, was his father? He couldn't wrap his head around it. He had been told his whole life that his parents were gone, that he was just another face in a system that didn't care. And now suddenly a new truth emerged, one that shook the foundation of everything he had ever known. Memories from his childhood surged forward, of foster homes, of broken promises, of never having a family to call his own. Each memory now felt like a lie, and the world around him seemed to shift beneath his feet. The father he had imagined in his mind as a child never came close to the man standing before him. Jason had always imagined someone kind, someone who would come to take him away from the chaos. But now, this revelation was so much more complicated. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was his reality. Mr. Anderson's voice interrupted his spiraling thoughts. I know this is a lot to take in, Jason, but I can explain everything. There's so much I need to tell you. Jason shook his head, still unable to process the truth. I don't know what to believe. The words came out ragged, filled with a mixture of disbelief and rising panic. How could this man, this stranger, be his father? How could he have been so close all these years, and yet Jason had never known him? The restaurant around them buzzed with life, but Jason felt a strange isolation. It was as if the world had paused just for him, and in that silence, the truth hung between them, as undeniable as it was impossible. A lost son, a hidden family, a connection he never knew existed. For a moment, Jason didn't know what to do with this new reality. Was this man truly his father? And if he was, what did it mean for everything he had ever believed about himself? The storm of emotions, confusion, anger, and disbelief whirled inside him, making it hard to breathe. But then something deep inside him began to shift, a small flicker of hope. Could this really be the beginning of the family he had always dreamed of? Or was it just another piece of the puzzle that would never fit? As Mr. Anderson stepped closer, his expression filled with sincerity, Jason's heart pounded in his chest. The answers Jason had always sought were just within reach. But could he trust them? Could he trust the man who stood before him, offering a truth that seemed impossible? Jason sat down at the table, his mind still racing with the overwhelming revelation. The noise of the restaurant returned to him, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the sizzling sound from the kitchen. But it felt distant, as if he were in a completely different world. He couldn't shake the image of Mr. Anderson's face, of the words, "I'm your father," echoing in his ears. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a heavy burden. Mr. Anderson sat across from him, watching Jason closely, his eyes filled with something Jason couldn't quite decipher. Was it guilt, regret, or genuine concern? He leaned forward, his voice low and careful. "Jason, your mother, she kept your birth a secret," Mr. Anderson began, his words deliberate, as if he were choosing them carefully. "When she passed away, the truth finally came to light. Your birth was kept hidden from me. For years, I had no idea that you existed." Jason's heart skipped a beat. His mind struggled to keep up with the information. His mother had kept this from him. His whole life, he had been told one story, and now in an instant, that story was unraveling. The shock still clung to him, but now a mixture of anger and hurt was taking its place. How could she have done this to him? How could she have kept such an important part of his life a secret? Mr. Anderson continued, his voice softer now. "I'm not proud of the way things were handled, Jason, but I've spent years trying to find you. I wanted to make it right. I know this is a lot to process, but you don't have to be a waiter anymore. You don't have to live like this. Let me help you." Jason's chest tightened. The words hit him like a slap, but it wasn't the offer of help that angered him. It was the implication. He wasn't some poor, helpless soul in need of saving. He had built his life piece by piece on his own. And now this man, this stranger who claimed to be his father, was offering to fix everything with his wealth and status. Jason looked up at Mr. Anderson, his anger burning behind his eyes. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't need your help." For a moment, Jason felt a tremor of emotion he hadn't expected. The anger, the hurt, the feeling of betrayal, it all surged through him, building like a storm inside. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. The restaurant felt even quieter now. The eyes of those around him seemed to watch his every move. "I've worked my whole life for what I have, what I've earned." Jason's voice shook with emotion, but it was resolute. "I didn't need a father to do that. I did it myself." He stood there facing Mr. Anderson, who was now sitting in stunned silence. Jason felt the weight of the room closing in around him. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of power, not from wealth or family connections, but from the truth he had fought for on his own. Mr. Anderson opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, but Jason turned away, his decision clear. He didn't need anyone's help, not now, and not from someone who had kept him in the dark for so long. Jason walked away from the table, his steps firm, his resolve even stronger. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he knew he could face it alone. Jason burst out of the restaurant, the cold night air hitting him like a slap to the face. His breath came in sharp gasps, his heart racing as he stormed down the sidewalk. The weight of everything, the revelation, the anger, the confusion, pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. He needed to get away, to put some distance between himself and Mr. Anderson, the man who claimed to be his father. But before he could take another step, he heard footsteps behind him. Jason spun around, his frustration flaring up again as Mr. Anderson emerged from the restaurant, his coat flapping in the wind. "Jason, wait!" Mr. Anderson called out, his voice strained. Jason clenched his fists, trying to calm himself, but the words spilled out before he could stop them. "You don't understand," Jason said, his voice thick with frustration. "You've lived your life with everything handed to you. I've had to fight for every single thing I have. You don't get to just walk in and fix everything with your money, with your name. You don't get to do that." Mr. Anderson stopped in his tracks, his face softening as he took in Jason's words. The space between them felt charged, the silence hanging in the air heavy with unspoken emotions. "I know," Mr. Anderson said quietly, his voice filled with genuine regret. "I know it's not easy, Jason, but maybe you don't have to do it alone anymore." Jason shook his head, the anger still burning in his chest. "I'm not some charity case. I don't need your pity." But despite his harsh words, Jason's heart wavered. Beneath the layers of anger and hurt, there was something else, something he couldn't ignore. The truth, the answer to the questions that had plagued him for so long, was right in front of him. His father, this man he had never known, was offering him a chance to finally understand what had happened, why he had been left in the dark for all these years. Jason hesitated, his mind torn between pride and the deep, yearning need to understand. For the first time in his life, the idea of family didn't seem like a distant dream. There was an undeniable pull in his chest, a desire to know more, to fill the emptiness that had always lingered. Jason didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there in the cold, the weight of everything shifting ever so slightly. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had always believed. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and emotion. Jason found himself tossing and turning in bed, the weight of the truth heavy on his chest. His life had always been a series of struggles, each victory earned with sweat and sacrifice. But now the revelation that Mr. Anderson was his father turned everything upside down. He couldn't escape the feeling that everything he had known was a lie. His mother's silence, the absence of a father in his life, was it all part of some twisted game? Why had he been kept in the dark for so long? But amidst the turmoil, a small voice inside him refused to let go of the one possibility that had been slowly creeping into his heart. Could he really have a family? Could the man who stood before him, the man with wealth, power, and influence, offer him something more than just money? Could this be the chance he had been waiting for? The chance to belong to something bigger than himself? That night, Jason found himself standing outside Mr. Anderson's office building. The city was quiet, the hum of traffic distant, but Jason's mind was alive with questions, with the need for answers. He had decided. He couldn't keep running from the truth. He had to hear Mr. Anderson out to see if this was really the path he wanted to take. As he walked through the doors of the building, the familiar sterile scent of polished marble and fresh carpet hit him. The luxury, the power, it all felt like a world he could never belong to. Yet here he was, about to sit face to face with the man who claimed to be his father. Mr. Anderson greeted him with a warm smile, a surprising contrast to the cold, calculating businessman Jason had imagined. His face softened when he saw Jason, as if he had been expecting him. Without a word, he gestured for him to sit. "I'm glad you came," Mr. Anderson said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of something deeper. "I know you've been through a lot, Jason, and I know it's not easy, but I want you to understand something." Jason sat down, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. He met Mr. Anderson's gaze, waiting for him to continue. "I'm not offering you a life of luxury, Jason," Mr. Anderson said, his tone firm. "I'm not asking you to abandon everything you've worked for, but I can offer you something more, a chance to be part of something bigger than yourself, something that could change everything for you, if you're willing to take the leap." Jason's heart raced. The words hung in the air like a promise, but Jason couldn't quite grasp them. A chance to be part of something bigger? Was this what he had been waiting for all his life? Could he really accept the family he had never known? The family that had been kept from him all these years? Jason's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, but also hope. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience before. Could this be the turning point in his life? The moment when everything changed? "I've worked for everything I have, Mr. Anderson," Jason said, his voice low, unsure. "Can I really trust you? Can I accept this life you're offering?" The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Jason's question hanging between them. Mr. Anderson leaned forward, his expression serious but sincere. "You don't have to make any decisions tonight, Jason," he said quietly. "But I want you to know that you don't have to face this alone anymore. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." Jason stared at him, his emotions raw and conflicted. A family? A chance to be part of something bigger than himself? Could he take that chance? Or would he turn his back on the one thing he had always longed for? Jason sat back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The decision he was about to make would change his life forever, and he knew it. The luxurious office around him, the power, the money, it all felt like a dream. But was it his dream? Was this the life he had wanted all along? Or had he simply built it out of necessity, out of survival? For the first time, Jason wasn't sure where his heart truly lay. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. Mr. Anderson watched him carefully, waiting, his gaze steady, but full of something Jason hadn't seen before. Hope. It was almost as if, for once, he wasn't just a businessman trying to make a deal. He was a father, hoping to connect with a son he never knew he had. Jason's mind raced. He could see the life Mr. Anderson offered him, the world of wealth and influence, the life of a son who never had to struggle again. It was tempting, but the question remained. Was that what he truly wanted? Would this new life fill the hole that had been carved out by years of loneliness and unanswered questions? Or was it simply an illusion? He took a deep breath, his chest tightening with the weight of his own uncertainty. His entire life, he had fought for every scrap, worked his fingers to the bone for every ounce of respect. Could he truly let go of all that and step into a world where everything had been handed to him? Looking up at Mr. Anderson, Jason's voice cracked, but he managed to speak with conviction. "I'll give it a chance, but not because of your money, not because of anything you've done for me, but because I need to know who I am, where I belong." The words left his mouth before he could fully understand them. Jason wasn't choosing this life because of the wealth or power. He wasn't doing it for the fame or status. He was doing it because, for the first time, he felt like he might finally have a place in the world. A place where he wasn't just surviving, but living. Mr. Anderson's face softened, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Jason to choose his own path, and now he was ready to help him navigate it. As Jason stood up from the table, the gravity of his decision sank in. The future was uncertain, but for the first time he didn't feel alone. He wasn't just walking into a world of luxury and power, he was walking into the unknown, but with the chance to finally understand who he truly was. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be his. The camera panned slowly over the vast city skyline, its lights twinkling like a million possibilities. Jason walks away from the towering office building, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders, but his heart filled with a new sense of purpose. His past, marked by struggle and uncertainty, now feels like a distant memory. For the first time, he walks forward with a clear goal: to discover who he truly is and what kind of future he can build, not based on his past, but on his potential. His footsteps echo in the quiet night, and despite the uncertainty of what tomorrow holds, Jason no longer feels lost. There is a hint of hope in his eyes, a realization that while his journey won't be without challenges, it's one he no longer has to face alone. The family he never had, the wealth he never dreamed of, and the power he never thought possible are now part of his reality. But more importantly, Jason now has a choice, a chance to define himself on his own terms, to bridge the gap between the life he built for himself and the world he's been given. As he walks into the night, one thing is certain: his life has changed forever. And with every step, Jason embraces a new beginning.